It was measured by how much you obeyed. Approval wasn't given freely, it was earned by sacrifice. And the highest sacrifice of all was to give up your own dreams for theirs. As a child, I wanted to believe that one day I would accept it, that one day the fire inside me would die, and I'd finally feel the pride my father felt, the pride my grandfather demanded. But each year that passed, I realized the opposite was happening. The fire wasn't fading, it was spreading, and it terrified me, because the more I wanted freedom, the more guilty I felt. Every secret dream became a betrayal. Every stolen moment of joy felt like treason. I was living two lives. The obedient child they wanted to see, and the restless soul I was too afraid to reveal. And little by little, I began to understand this wasn't just childhood anymore. This was the beginning of war, not with them, but with myself. As I grew older, the invisible chains of tradition tightened around me. They were never spoken of directly, yet they were everywhere, woven into conversations, etched into every glance, lurking behind every word my family spoke. By the time I was a teenager, those chains were no longer subtle. They became explicit, iron bars disguised as love and honor. My father often stood at the head of the dinner table, his voice steady, his eyes sharp. He didn't need to raise his tone. The weight of his words carried enough power to silence an entire room. Our family does not bend. Our family does not break. We are who we are because of tradition. It is not just what we do, it is who we are. And then his eyes would fall on me. Not on my cousins, not on my siblings, me, as if to remind me that this inheritance was not just expected, it was inevitable. I tried to nod, tried to smile, tried to look proud, but deep inside, every word felt like another chain locking around my chest. I could almost hear it, the sound of a key turning, bolts sliding into place, trapping me in a future I didn't want. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what it would feel like to live my own life. What if I could choose my own path? What if I could build something new, something mine? But then guilt would wash over me like a tidal wave, because in my family, even thinking about leaving was betrayal, and betrayal was unforgivable. The chains were not only external, they were inside me. Shame became a weapon. Whenever I felt joy in something different, I immediately felt the sting of guilt. Whenever I imagined a different life, I saw my father's disappointed face. Whenever I dared to think of freedom, I heard my grandfather's voice thundering in my head. Without tradition, you are nothing. The more I resisted, the heavier those words became. It wasn't just about family pride, it was about identity. If I walked away, who was I? If I rejected the family path, what was left of me? It was as though I had no name, no worth, no existence without them. And yet, deep inside, the fire still burned. It whispered to me in the quiet moments, in the stillness of night, in the rare seconds when I was truly alone. It said, "You don't belong here. This is not your destiny." I tried to silence it. I tried to bury it under obligations, under obedience, under fear. But it refused to die. The chains clinked louder with every passing year. Every time my father introduced me to someone with pride, saying, "This is my son, the one who will carry on the tradition." I smiled, but inside I was screaming. Every time relatives praised me for being the future of the family, I bowed my head. But inside I wanted to run. I was trapped between two prisons. The prison of obedience, where I lost myself, and the prison of guilt, where freedom meant dishonor. I didn't know which was worse. I only knew that one day something would break. Either the chains around me, or me. It started small. So small that no one noticed. At least, I hoped they didn't. Rebellion, in my family, was dangerous. Even the slightest sign of resistance could shatter the fragile respect between generations. So if I was going to push back, I had to do it in silence. My first act of defiance was simple. I began to dream aloud, but not to them, to myself. In the privacy of my thoughts, I whispered the truth I could never say at the dinner table. I don't want this life. I want something else. At school, while my cousins boasted about how ready they were to carry on the family legacy, I chose different conversations. I talked about art, about books, about places I wanted to see. I laughed with friends about futures that had nothing to do with duty. But as soon as I stepped back into my house, I erased those words from my tongue, buried them deep inside, and wore the mask of the perfect child. I was born into a family where tradition wasn't just important, it was absolute. It was the first lesson I learned long before I could even write my own name. To my family, tradition was more than culture. It was law. It was the air we breathed, the rhythm of every heartbeat, the reason we existed. When I was a child, I didn't question it. I didn't even understand it. But I felt it. I felt it in the way my father's voice would harden whenever he spoke about duty. I felt it in the way my grandfather's eyes narrowed whenever someone mentioned change. I felt it in the way my mother's smile, though warm, always carried a quiet fear. Fear that one of us might disappoint. Fear that one of us might rebel. From the moment I could walk, my path was already written. There was no discussion, no gentle conversation about what I wanted. It wasn't about my dreams or my interests. It was about the family. Always the family. My earliest memories of family gatherings weren't about joy or laughter. They were about speeches. They were about reminders. One uncle would stand and remind us of who we were. Another cousin would tell a story of how they sacrificed for the name we carried. It was like a ceremony, an endless cycle of voices echoing the same words. We are who we are because of tradition. Without it, we are nothing. As a child, I clapped when everyone else clapped. I nodded when everyone else nodded. I smiled when everyone else smiled. But deep down, I was already different, because even as a boy, I felt the sting of something I couldn't yet describe. It wasn't pride, it was pressure. It wasn't honor, it was weight. The older I got, the more I realized that what they called duty, I felt as chains. Every story my father told me about his sacrifices made me wonder what he had given up. Every word my grandfather spoke about responsibility made me imagine a different life he might have lived if he had been free. And maybe that was my greatest sin, because instead of seeing tradition as a gift, I saw it as a cage. But of course, I never said that out loud. How could I? I was just a child. And in my family, children weren't meant to speak. They were meant to listen, to obey, to carry the weight of a history they never chose. So I carried it. I carried it in silence. I carried it in fear. I carried it with a smile painted on my face while my heart whispered, "This is not the life you want." Growing up in my family was like living in a house where every wall whispered the same command. Do not stray. Do not question. Do not dream outside the lines we drew for you. I remember being 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor while my father read stories of our ancestors. To me, they weren't fairy tales. They were warnings. Each story carried the same message. Those who obeyed tradition became heroes, and those who strayed became nothing. I was too young to fully understand what tradition even meant, but I understood the look in my father's eyes when he told me, "One day, this will all be yours." It wasn't a gift, it was a sentence, and even as a child, I felt it. Other kids I knew talked about what they wanted to be when they grew up. Some said fireman, some said teacher, some said astronaut. Me? I never answered, because deep down I already knew what I was supposed to say. I will carry the family tradition. But that wasn't the truth. It wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't who I was. At school, when teachers asked about our dreams, I hesitated. If I said what I really wanted, to create my own path, to explore a different life, I felt like I was betraying my family. So instead, I stayed quiet. I told half-truths. I smiled and nodded, pretending that my future was already decided with pride, when in reality it was decided with fear. There were moments, though, small, fleeting moments when I escaped. At night, when everyone thought I was asleep, I'd hide under the covers with a flashlight and a book that had nothing to do with tradition. Stories about explorers, inventors, dreamers, people who built their lives with their own hands, not because someone told them to, but because they chose to. Every page lit a fire in me, one that I couldn't admit to anyone, because in my house, even dreaming of a different life was considered rebellion. I tried to silence that fire. I told myself, this is just childhood imagination. It will fade. But the truth? It only grew stronger. The older I became, the heavier the expectations grew. The speeches at family gatherings weren't just background noise anymore. They were commands directed at me. The gentle nudges became strict reminders, and the reminders became obligations. I learned quickly that in my family, love was conditional. My second act of rebellion was reading. Not the books my father handed me about history and family honor, but stories of people who carved their own paths. I devoured every page like oxygen, like the secret air I wasn't supposed to breathe. It was dangerous, intoxicating, liberating. Those books became my sanctuary, the only place I felt alive. But rebellion, no matter how quiet, always leaves traces. Sometimes my father would notice my distracted eyes and ask, "What are you thinking about?" I'd panic, my heart racing, and quickly answer with something safe. About the family business, about the future. But the truth was, I'd been imagining what it would be like to escape, to walk away, to build a life untouched by their expectations. And then came my third act of rebellion, saying no. Not a loud, dramatic no, just small refusals. If my relatives asked me to join in certain rituals, I hesitated. If my cousins bragged about sacrifices they were ready to make, I stayed silent. If my grandfather's voice boomed about honor, I lowered my eyes but refused to nod. They thought I was shy. They thought I was quiet. But the truth was, I was resisting, inch by inch, moment by moment. Still, rebellion was not freedom. Every step I took away from their path filled me with fear. What if they saw through me? What if they discovered my secret? What if one mistake shattered the illusion of obedience I worked so hard to maintain? The worst part wasn't the fear of punishment. It was the fear of disappointment. I could endure their anger, but I couldn't endure their sadness. The thought of seeing my father's eyes filled with betrayal, or my mother's tears falling because of me, was unbearable. So I lived two lives. By day, the dutiful child, silent and obedient. By night, the dreamer, the rebel, the one who dared to imagine something more, but living two lives, tears a person apart. Each day, I felt the rift inside me widening. Each day, I wondered how long I could keep the mask on before it cracked. And somewhere deep down, I knew the truth. Silent rebellion could not last forever. Sooner or later, I would have to choose, to live for them, or to finally live for myself. Every story of rebellion has a moment when silence can no longer hold the weight of truth. For me, that moment came like a storm I had been pretending wasn't on the horizon. But storms don't ask for permission. They break when they're ready. It began at a family gathering. The room was filled with voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of tradition being celebrated once again. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture proud, his smile broad, and then he said it. He raised his glass and announced, "My son will soon take on his rightful place. He will honor this family. He will carry on what we have built." Everyone applauded. Smiles turned toward me. Nods of approval, pats on the back. Whispers of pride filled the room. But inside, something snapped. I tried to smile, but my lips trembled. My chest tightened as if the chains I had carried for so long were suddenly pulled to their breaking point. For years, I had swallowed my truth. For years, I had nodded, obeyed, played the role they demanded. But in that moment, surrounded by eyes filled with expectations I could no longer bear, the words burst out of me before I could stop them. "I don't want this." The room fell silent. Forks froze mid-air. The hum of laughter died instantly. My father's smile collapsed into a hard, cold stare. He blinked slowly as though he couldn't comprehend what he had just heard. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice sharp but low. My hands were trembling, but the fire inside me, hidden for so long, roared to life. I said, I don't want this life. I don't want the tradition. I want something different, something that's mine. Gasps echoed around the table. Relatives exchanged glances of disbelief. My mother's hand went to her mouth, and my father's face darkened in a way I had never seen before. His voice rose, not in volume, but in weight. Do you understand what you are saying? Do you understand what you are throwing away? I nodded, though my throat ached. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to look away. Yes, I understand, but I can't keep living someone else's life. I need my own. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. It was the silence of betrayal, the silence of centuries of tradition, crumbling in one single confession. And in that silence, I felt two things at once: terror and freedom. Terror, because I knew the consequences of my words would echo for years. Freedom, because for the first time in my life, I had spoken my truth aloud. The chains that bound me for so long hadn't vanished, but they had cracked. And cracks, no matter how small, can spread. They can shatter walls. They can destroy prisons. They can open doors. That night, my world changed forever. Not because I was free, but because I had finally declared that I wanted to be. The silence after my confession felt endless. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, heavy, like the air itself had turned to stone. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were fixed on me, as if I had just cursed the family name aloud. My father's face was unreadable. No anger, no shouting, just a deep, piercing stare that cut through me more than any words ever could. I almost wished he had yelled, slammed his fist on the table, called me a disgrace. That at least would have been something I could fight against. But the silence was worse. Finally, he pushed back his chair. The screech of wood against the floor sounded like thunder in the stillness. He didn't look at me again. He just walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, each one pounding against my chest like a hammer. My mother's eyes were wet, but she didn't speak. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to say something, anything, but fear held her back. A single tear slid down her cheek as she lowered her gaze. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other, their faces twisted in shock and judgment. No one came to my side. No one said, "It's okay." I stood there alone, trembling, my heart racing, my body screaming for me to run. That night, the house was colder than ever. No one spoke to me. Dinner was silent, the air thick with disappointment. When I tried to break the silence with small words, no one answered. It was as if my voice had been erased from the family altogether. Later, I overheard my uncles in hushed tones. "He doesn't understand what he's doing. He's throwing away everything." And my grandmother's whisper, "Better a child with no freedom than a child with no honor." Those words cut deeper than any blade, because in their eyes I was no longer the heir. I was a wound, a stain, a disappointment they couldn't cleanse. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, the silence screaming louder than any argument ever could. For years, I had feared this moment. For years, I had imagined the fallout. But I never imagined how empty it would feel, how isolating, how cold. And yet, buried beneath the shame and fear was a flicker of something else, a fragile flame that whispered, "You did it. You spoke your truth. You survived." The aftermath wasn't freedom. It was exile. It was pain. It was heartbreak. But it was also the first taste of life on my own terms. And once you taste that, even for a moment, you can never go back. Freedom isn't free. That's something people don't tell you when they romanticize breaking away, chasing your own dreams, or following your heart. It sounds beautiful in theory, courageous, heroic, but the reality? The reality is that freedom comes with a price, and my price was steep. After that night, nothing was the same. My father no longer looked at me the same way. Where once there had been pride, there was now distance. Where once There had been warmth. There was coldness sharp enough to cut. He stopped speaking to me unless it was necessary. And when he did, his words were short, clipped, each syllable carrying disappointment. It was as though he no longer spoke to a son, but to a stranger who had broken his trust. My mother tried to bridge the gap, but her voice trembled each time she said my name. Her eyes carried a sadness I couldn't bear to meet. I knew she still loved me, but love mixed with sorrow is a heavy kind of love. It suffocates instead of heals. Family gatherings became a battlefield of silence. My cousins avoided me, as if my rebellion was contagious, as if standing too close to me would somehow poison their loyalty. Relatives whispered behind closed doors, their voices dripping with judgment. I was still part of the family, yes, but I was no longer one of them. And the worst cost wasn't even the isolation. It was the guilt, because even as I tried to stand tall in my truth, a part of me wondered if I had betrayed them. If choosing myself meant I had destroyed everything they had built, everything they had sacrificed. That guilt wrapped itself around me like chains I thought I had broken. Every night, I lay awake replaying the moment, hearing my father's silence, my mother's tears, my grandmother's words. Better a child with no freedom than a child with no honor. And yet, despite the pain, despite the exile, despite the crushing loneliness, there was something else. A small, quiet certainty growing inside me. A voice that whispered in the darkness. This is what freedom feels like. Messy, costly, painful, but real. Because for the first time, my life was mine, not theirs, not bound to their traditions, not written by someone else's hand. Every choice I made now carried the weight of consequence, but also the beauty of possibility. Yes, the cost of freedom was high. It tore me from the embrace of my family. It branded me with guilt I would carry for years. It left scars I still trace with my fingers when no one is watching. But I realized something important. The cost of freedom, no matter how heavy, is still cheaper than the cost of living a life that isn't yours. And I chose to pay it. Every single day. When you break away from something that has defined you your whole life, you don't immediately feel free. You feel lost, like stepping out of a cage only to realize you have no map, no compass, no idea where to go. That's where I found myself. Free, but aimless. Liberated, but lonely. I left home more often, wandering the city streets at night just to escape the walls of silence inside the house. Neon signs glowed above me. Strangers passed me by, and I wondered if they carried their own battles the way I carried mine. Sometimes I sat on a park bench until the early hours of morning, staring at the stars, asking them questions I wasn't ready to answer. Who am I without their expectations? What do I really want? Was all of this worth it? At first, I chased distractions. I threw myself into work, into projects, into anything that could numb the ache of isolation. But no matter how hard I tried, there was always an emptiness inside me, a space once filled by tradition, by belonging, even by obligation. It turns out, when you strip away who your family tells you to be, you're left with a terrifying question. Who are you, really? The search wasn't glamorous. It wasn't filled with easy answers or cinematic breakthroughs. It was messy. It was late nights of doubt, mornings of regret, afternoons of restlessness. It was stumbling through mistakes, failing more often than succeeding. But slowly, I began to see pieces of myself I had never noticed before. I discovered passions buried beneath years of silence. I found joy in small things, writing down my thoughts, taking photographs of forgotten corners of the city, listening to music that spoke to my soul instead of my duty. I realized that my voice, the one I had buried for so long, had things to say. And with every step I took toward this new identity, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just running from my family's tradition anymore. I was running toward something else, something undefined but real, something that belonged only to me. The search for myself wasn't about finding a clear answer. It was about learning to live in the questions. It was about accepting that I might never fully know who I am, but that the journey itself is what makes me whole. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. To choose your own questions, your own path, your own life, even if it's uncertain, especially if it's uncertain. I thought I was completely alone. I thought no one would ever understand what I was going through. And maybe that's what hurt the most, believing that my voice would forever echo in an empty room. But life has a strange way of sending you the right person at the right time. Not when you expect it, not when you're prepared, but when you're desperate enough to need them. For me, that person was an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. We met by accident on the corner of a busy street in the blur of rushing crowds and honking cars. She recognized me before I recognized her. Her smile was warm, unguarded, the kind of smile that feels like sunlight after months of rain. At first, we exchanged small talk. The usual, "How have you been? What are you doing these days?" But there was something in her eyes, something that told me she could see through the cracks I tried so hard to hide. And before I knew it, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. Words spilled out of me. My story, my struggle, my rebellion, my guilt, all of it. I expected judgment. I expected the same silence I had grown used to. But instead, she listened. Really listened. Her gaze never wavered. Her expression never turned away. And when I finished, bracing myself for rejection, she said something I'll never forget. "You're not broken. You're brave." Those 4 words hit harder than any lecture, any condemnation, any silence I had endured, because for the first time, someone saw me not as a traitor to tradition, not as a disappointment to my family, but as a human being, flawed, scared, but still worthy. We began meeting more often, coffee shops, long walks, late-night conversations that stretched into dawn. She became my anchor, the one who reminded me that I wasn't crazy for wanting something different, that my life was still worth building, even if it didn't match the blueprint handed to me. With her, I laughed again. With her, I remembered what it felt like to breathe, without shame, pressing against my chest. She didn't fix my problems, and she didn't pretend to have the answers. But she stood beside me, and sometimes that's all you really need. Someone willing to stand in your storm without running away. She was the unexpected ally I didn't know I was searching for. And with her support, I began to believe, just a little, that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. Maybe, just maybe, I could keep moving forward. For the longest time, my life had been defined by what I didn't want. I didn't want the tradition. I didn't want the silence. I didn't want to live a life written by someone else's hand. But standing still in rejection is not the same as moving forward in creation. And it took me a long time to realize that. With her by my side, my unexpected ally, I began to imagine something new. Not just an escape, not just a rebellion, but a life that was mine. A future shaped not by fear of my family's disappointment, but by the quiet pull of my own desires. At first, the dream was blurry. Like looking through a fogged-up window, I could barely make out the outlines. But slowly, with every conversation, every step forward, every little moment of courage, the fog began to clear. I started to see myself doing things I once thought impossible, pursuing a career I loved even if it wasn't honorable in their eyes, traveling, meeting new people, discovering the vastness of the world beyond the narrow walls I grew up inside, building something of my own, something that carried my name, not my family's legacy. And for the first time, the thought didn't scare me. It excited me. It made my chest tighten, not with dread, but with possibility. I began writing down my goals in a notebook, scribbling ideas late into the night. Some were small: learn a new skill, save enough money to move out, take one step away from the shadows of tradition. Others were big, almost frightening: create a business, write a book, build a life that could one day inspire others like me. Each page of that notebook became a promise to myself that I would not waste this freedom, no matter how much it had cost me. A promise that I would honor the pain by turning it into purpose. And as the dream grew clearer, so did I. I was no longer just the child who said no to tradition. I was becoming the person who could finally say yes to life, The dream wasn't perfect, it wasn't fully formed. It shifted with time, reshaped itself as I stumbled and learned. But it was mine, and that was enough. For the first time, I looked toward the future and saw more than a shadow of what I left behind. I saw a horizon waiting to be claimed, and I knew, whatever came next, it would be on my terms. No matter how far you run, the past has a way of finding you. And for me, that moment came sooner than I expected. It started with a phone call, my mother's voice on the other end, trembling but firm. "We need to talk. All of us." My heart dropped into my stomach. I knew what she meant. This wasn't a casual dinner invitation. This was a reckoning, a confrontation I had spent months dreading. The night of the meeting, I walked into my childhood home and felt the weight of every memory pressing against me. The walls, the photographs, the smell of old wood, they all whispered of who I used to be, who they still expected me to be. But I wasn't that person anymore. The entire family was there. Faces I hadn't seen in months, some filled with disappointment, others with curiosity. And then there was my father, sitting at the head of the table, silent, his presence heavier than any words. No one spoke at first. The silence was unbearable. Every second stretched like an eternity. Finally, my father broke it. His voice was low, controlled, but laced with anger. "Do you even understand what you've done to this family?" The question hit me like a blow, and for a moment I wanted to shrink, to apologize, to fall back into the role I had played my entire life. But I couldn't, not anymore. I looked at him, at the man whose approval I had chased for so long, and I realized something. This was not about choosing between honor and dishonor. This was about choosing between a life of silence and a life of truth. So I spoke. My voice shook at first, but grew stronger with every word. "I know you see me as a disgrace. I know I've broken the path you laid out for me, but I can't live a life that isn't mine. I can't spend my days pretending to be someone I'm not. I love you. I love this family, but love should not feel like a cage." The room erupted. Some shouted, some begged me to reconsider. Others looked away, ashamed or afraid to take sides, but I stood my ground. For the first time, I wasn't asking for permission. I was claiming my right to exist as myself. My father's face hardened, his fists clenched on the table. I braced myself for the final rejection, but then something I didn't expect happened. His eyes filled with tears. Tears I had never seen from him before. He whispered, almost too soft to hear, "You've taken from me the only thing I thought I could control, my child's future." And in that moment, the anger between us shifted, because behind his fury was fear. Fear of losing me, fear of letting go of everything he believed kept the family together. It didn't heal us, not instantly. But for the first time, we weren't enemies. We were two human beings, flawed, broken, afraid, trying to reach across a lifetime of silence. The confrontation was brutal. It tore open wounds that had festered for years. But it was necessary, because without it, there could be no beginning. The confrontation left me shaken. My voice was raw, my body trembling, my heart pounding as if it had run a marathon. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, relief. Because for the first time in my life, I had spoken my truth. I hadn't hidden, I hadn't pretended. And yet, the room was heavy with silence. No one knew what to say. My father's tears still lingered in my mind, fragile proof that he was not as unbreakable as I had always believed. For so long, I had thought of him as a wall, cold, immovable, unyielding. But maybe, just maybe, he was human too. The days that followed were strange. We didn't speak much. Conversations were clipped, awkward, full of pauses that felt like chasms. But something had shifted. He no longer looked at me with only anger. Sometimes, just for a fleeting second, I caught glimpses of something else. Uncertainty, maybe even sorrow. I realized then that this was not going to be a clean break or a neat resolution. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about building a bridge. A fragile bridge, made not of wood or stone, but of small moments, tentative steps, and the willingness to keep trying. One evening, I found him sitting alone on the porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to walk away. But instead, I sat down beside him. For minutes, we said nothing. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was unfinished. Finally, he spoke. "You remind me of myself," he said quietly. I turned to him, startled. "When I was young, I wanted something different too, but I buried it because I thought family came first. I thought sacrifice was the only way to show love." His words broke me open. All this time, I had seen him as the enforcer, the jailer, the one holding the chains. But now I saw something else, a man who had given up his own dreams, convincing himself it was the right thing and resenting anyone who dared to do otherwise. For the first time, I felt compassion for him. Not agreement, not surrender, but compassion. Because he was not my enemy. He was another prisoner of the same tradition I had fought to escape. That night, we didn't resolve everything. We didn't suddenly heal decades of silence. But we began to speak, not as father and child locked in a battle, but as two people learning to see each other beyond the roles we had been forced to play. It was fragile, it was uncertain, but it was a beginning. A fragile bridge stretching over a lifetime of distance, waiting to see if it could hold. Freedom is never free. It may not come with a price tag, but it demands payment all the same. And in the quiet that followed the storm of confrontation, I began to count the cost. There were people in my family who still refused to speak to me, aunts and uncles who shook their heads when my name came up, cousins who looked at me with pity as if I had thrown away everything for nothing. And there was a distance, a cold, heavy silence that lingered even in the smallest gatherings. I had chosen a different life, but in choosing it, I had also chosen to lose parts of the old one. Traditions I once took for granted were no longer mine to share. Holidays felt different, marked by absence instead of togetherness. And the weight of that loss sometimes felt unbearable. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I had made a mistake, if the price was too high, if maybe the cage I had broken free from was at least safer, at least warmer than the lonely road I now walked. But then I would remind myself, the cage was never safety. It was slow suffocation. And even in my loneliest moments, the air of freedom was worth breathing. Still, freedom brought with it more than loneliness. It brought responsibility. No family script to follow, no clear roadmap. Every choice was mine, every failure my own to carry. And that weight was heavy too. I worked jobs that barely paid the bills, sometimes doubting if chasing my dream was naive. I faced rejection after rejection, doors slammed in my face, people telling me I'd regret turning away from an easier path. And every stumble echoed louder because there was no safety net waiting to catch me. But here's the truth. Every sacrifice, every scar, every sleepless night was proof that this life was mine. Not given, not inherited, not forced upon me. Mine. And strangely, that realization gave me strength, because freedom is not about living without pain. It's about choosing the pain that shapes you, instead of the pain that chains you. So yes, freedom cost me dearly. It cost me pieces of my family, the comfort of certainty, the illusion of belonging. But it gave me something greater, the chance to become myself. And that, no matter the price, was worth it. After all the storms, the tears, the silence, and the cost, there came a moment when I realized I couldn't keep looking back forever. The past had shaped me, yes, but it didn't have to chain me anymore. For the first time in years, the road ahead didn't look like a burden. It looked like possibility. Scary, uncertain, unpredictable, but alive. And maybe that was enough. I began to build, piece by piece, the life I had always imagined but never dared to chase. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was mine. I started small, writing down goals, chasing opportunities, even when they felt too big for me. I fell, I failed, But every failure was a lesson that belonged to me, not a punishment from a tradition I didn't believe in. I surrounded myself with people who saw me, not as a rebel, not as a disgrace, but as someone brave enough to carve out their own place in the world. Friends who became like family, mentors who showed me that success isn't measured by obedience, but by authenticity. Strangers who reminded me that I wasn't alone in wanting more. And slowly, step by shaky step, I began to see a new version of myself. Not the child bound by expectation, not the runaway desperate for escape, but someone stronger, someone freer, someone finally becoming. There were still shadows of the past, family dinners that felt hollow, moments when my father's eyes would drift as if mourning the future he once imagined for me. But even in those shadows, I found light, because we were learning to coexist, not as copies of tradition, but as flawed people finding new ways to love each other. The path forward was not about forgetting where I came from. It was about choosing where I was going. It was about honoring my family, not through blind obedience, but by becoming someone they could one day respect, not for following, but for daring to lead. And in that realization, I found peace. Not perfect peace, not permanent peace, but enough to keep walking forward, enough to keep building the life that was waiting for me. For so long, I believed legacy was something fixed, a rigid script passed down, generation to generation, a chain of traditions that could never be broken. But as I looked at the life I was building, I realized legacy isn't stone. It's clay. It can be reshaped. My family thought I had destroyed ours by walking away. But the truth is, I was rewriting it, not erasing the past, but refusing to let it dictate the future. Legacy doesn't have to mean blind obedience. It doesn't have to mean sacrificing your soul for the sake of appearances. It can mean courage. It can mean resilience. It can mean standing up and saying, "This ends with me. The suffering stops here." And maybe one day, if I have children of my own, they will see this too. They won't inherit a story of fear, silence, and forced duty. They will inherit a story of choice, a story of someone who dared to step off the path, to stumble, to rise, and to keep going anyway. For the first time, I saw that the greatest gift I could give my family wasn't my compliance. It was transformation. Because sometimes love doesn't mean keeping things the same. Sometimes love means breaking what is broken so something better can grow in its place. When I looked back at the generations before me, I saw lives marked by sacrifice and quiet resignation. But when I looked ahead, I saw something different. I saw possibility. I saw freedom. I saw a new legacy taking shape, one built not on fear, but on truth. And as heavy as the past still felt, that vision gave me strength, because I knew I wasn't just living for myself anymore. I was living for everyone who came after me, for everyone who had ever whispered in the dark, "I wish I could choose differently." This was my legacy. Not tradition, not silence, not chains, but freedom, courage, and the proof that a single choice could change everything. When I look back now, I see the scars. I see the nights of doubt, the tears, the silence that stretched like an endless road. I see the faces of those I disappointed and the shadows of traditions I left behind. But I also see something else. I see the first time I breathed freely, the first time I chose without fear, the first time I looked at the future and felt it was truly mine. I once thought breaking away meant losing everything, and in some ways I did lose a lot. But in that loss, I discovered something greater, the ability to create, to build, to live, not the life that was written for me, but the one I was brave enough to write for myself. My story is not perfect. It is messy. It is full of wrong turns and painful lessons. But it is real, and it is mine, and maybe that's all any of us can ask for. Not a flawless life, not a life that pleases everyone, but a life that feels true, a life that belongs to us, even if the world doesn't understand. So here I stand, not as the rebel child anymore, not as the runaway, not as the disappointment, but as someone who chose differently, someone who dared to believe there was more waiting beyond the walls of tradition, someone who now walks a path not defined by fear, but by freedom. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: We don't have to inherit the chains of the past. We don't have to carry the silence of generations. We can choose. We can change. We can rewrite the story. This is my life, my choice, my legacy. And finally, it feels like home.